attending to practical matters here, just making sure this gets recorded. So the Tibetan title of this is Tingri Gyachutamba, and also sometimes Gyechutamba. There's also a version which only has 80 verses. But as you maybe read in the introduction, Khyentse and Padampa started off with the 80-verse version and then went on with the 100-verse version. And it's called Tingri Gyachupa or Gyachuma because it all took place in this location, which is called Tingri, which is just on the northern side of Mount Everest, on the Tibetan side of Mount Everest. And there's a famous story about Padampa Sangyé, who threw a stone from India and sort of up in the direction of Tibet, and where it landed, he decided that's where he would teach, settle. And he had already been to Tibet a few times. Sometimes we say he'd been there 3 times, sometimes 5 times. Here it mentions it was his 3rd time. But anyway, it landed in Tibet, and it made the sound ding when it landed there. So this location is then henceforth known as Tingri. Ri meaning, I think, mountain. Ri generally means mountain. So the mountains around this Ding location. But it's still there, and if you're traveling from Lhasa down towards Kathmandu, to the border, just before you arrive there, I forget how far. I think it's like a half a day's journey or something. I think you go over one major pass afterwards, but then you pass by Tingri. And also, if you go further in from Tingri towards Mount Kailash, then you come to where Tulsi Rinpoche's monastery was, and also where Tulsi Rinpoche's teacher's monastery was. So this is called Rongbu, this monastery, and in this way also we have the endorsement from Tulsi Rinpoche as part of this particular set of teachings. Anyway, this is what it looks like in this region. It's very much like in Tibet, a lot of sky, and yes, you could say not a very lush environment, at least not in this part of Tibet. The tradition of Padampa Sangyé, I'm going to get back to the story of Padampa Sangyé, but it's generally associated with the practice of what we call pacification, which is based on the general Mahayana Prajnaparamita teachings, and is based on the confidence in the view in which the yogi would simply let go of all attachment to self. And as a consequence of that, this is what pacifies all suffering. We could say all our suffering originates from this tight fixation on the self. And letting go of this grip of fixation is what brings about the pacification of all suffering. And this was very much a practice of simply offering up what is most precious, namely one's body. And Padampa Sangyé had a very notable student, Machi Glabdran, who was a yogini, and who took this teaching further, combining it with the Mahamudra teachings, and very much formulated the very widespread practice of chud, where she would actually practice going to cemeteries and invoking all the spirits, non-humans, ghosts, ghouls, whatever, of the cemeteries, the charnel grounds. Invite all of them to have a piece of her. And as the practice of chud, some might know, consists then of imagining that you're offering up your body. It's not that you literally do this, but you generate the attitude, and you actually, there's an elaborate visualization where you offer your body as a nicely cooked feast. So this has been really a practice, particularly for advanced practitioners, to go everywhere and you could say enhance their practice and confront all their fears and so forth through going to charnel grounds and performing this practice. And to the right, then you see a contemporary practitioner of Chön, or at least 20th century. And the practice involves beautiful liturgy sung to a very lovely tune, where you invite all the those that you're inviting to your feast with a thigh bone trumpet, and you play the drum, and you have a bell also. But there's some very beautiful melodious practice that goes with that. So many practitioners, they would do this. And you also see behind they have this tent. So anyway, this practice originates from, then you could say, the inspiration of Padampa Sangyé. Here's a you could say traditional image of Padampa Sangye. Sometimes he's seen, as you saw before, seated like this. That's one way of representing him. And sometimes he's represented like this. He's generally regarded as rather ugly. If you read the story of Milarepa's meeting with Padampa Sangyé, then it describes how Padampa Sangye was this sort of dark Indian person, and slightly scary looking. And the story is that Padampa Sangye was actually somebody else. See, there was a great master in the early days of Buddhism in Tibet, his name was Kamalashila. And many of you might have heard of Kamalashchila's teaching, which is known as stages of meditation. His Holiness the Dalai Lama often teaches this. And at one point, Kamalashila was practicing a form of transference of consciousness, where you would actually enter freshly deceased bodies. You'd say, yeah. He was practicing that, and at the same time there was a yogi also practicing that, and the yogi was this not very attractive person, and he came across Kamalashila's uninhabited body and thought this was a recently deceased person. So he actually took the body and thought, oh, this is a really handsome person, lovely body, and he was very pleased with what he found. Kamalashila coming back to his own body, discovered that it was occupied, but he found the body of the Indian yogi. And so Kamalashila had no choice but to take the body of the yogi, and it's in this form then that Kamalashila then became known as Padampa Sangye. So generally we associate Kamalashila and Padampa Sangye with some very long lives. Anyway, the present teaching then originates at the end of Padampa Sangye's life, then at the time when he was in Tingri, and one of his students was worried that he was looking a bit old, and as you might have read, then he said, yes, in a year's time all you will find is the dead body of a hermit, an Indian hermit. So that's the settings for the present teaching here. Now, what we have then is what we call Upadesha. And this means that it's very short, very practical advice, not particularly philosophical. And so this really means that the assumption here is that we're already familiar with, you could say, the Buddhist worldview. I'm going to come back to this, but once we have that perspective, and particularly you could say the possibilities of our life, the volatility of our present life, the benefit that we could bring to our situation in terms of future lives, and all of that renders this teaching incredibly simple and profound. Now, you could say all these teachings like impermanence and the validity of the path and so forth is something that we might know. But the thing is, we need to be reminded of this. And so we as practitioners, we remind each other of that. But there's also the sense that when you get advice, it makes a big difference who's giving the advice. So that's why you could say just ordinary people say time is running out might not make that much an impression, but a teaching like the present one coming from, you could say, august source like Padampa Sangyé and also the likes of Kyabje Dilgo Khyentse, this makes this something that we would want to consider and take very seriously. So the teaching here is, you could say, somewhat advanced. At the same time, it's not really complicated. It does presume some, you could say, already existing groundwork. Here we have there's different publications. So depending which version you have, there's different covers. Anyway, you might have read Trungpa Rinpoche's introduction, which of course is essentially praising the nature of this teaching and also describing Padampa Sangyé, Kamala Shilas, and he then notes how Padampa Sangyé traveled to Tibet 3 times, how he took residence in Tingri, met Milarepa. And particularly Trungpa Rinpoche then highlights how Padampa Sangye reincarnated as a great master of the Buddhist teaching, the great Khyentse, Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo, and that we have then the fortune to hear this teaching from the re-embodiment of Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo. And Khyentse Wangpo also then is regarded as Padampa Sangye reincarnate. So this, he says, is something which is helpful for us, and it's helpful for everyone, everywhere. Of course, the thing is, we come from a somewhat different worldview. So for some people, the emphasis on reincarnation and so forth is a bit difficult to grasp. But in some sense, the practicality and immediacy, the intimacy of this teaching, and also it being addressed to lay people renders this incredibly relevant. Okay, let's do something here. I'm going to cut the web feed. Not much benefit in having yet another ugly person on the screen. So off it goes. Oh no, I'm still there. Hold on. Ha. All right. Now, as a Westerner, I'm always aware of you could say the optics or the view that we bring to something of this nature. And I'd like to really make a point about this. So I'd like to highlight the differences in the worldview that you could say we who were brought up in modernity. It's no longer really Western modernity, it's just as much part of Asian modernity. And how that differs from the worldview that we're encountering here, the basis of the worldview. So there's a little bit an emphasis on just discussing you could say, basic outlook and the premise of the discussions that we're finding in this text. So if you'll just bear with me, this is really just trying to be conscientious in regard to where we all are coming from then, not being from Tingri ourselves. So I think it's important that we realize whenever we come across a Buddhist text, we're operating with then a worldview and insight into the nature of reality that differs from the common assumption in this modernity. Now, it doesn't mean that we're embracing religion particularly. It's just that we see the conclusions and the analysis that the Buddha arrived at differ somewhat. You could say in Buddhism we analyze what we could call objective reality, and we see that it is ultimately empty. There's a sense that there is a cognizance, and yet that cannot be objectified and held. There's also the object of this cognizance, and that also seems to lack any ultimate solid reality. So you could say that this differs, of course, from the physicalist worldview, where we talk about some building blocks of our universe and the reality that we associate exclusively with the material. So um, in asserting this, you could say, worldview of essentially that phenomena appear to this cognizance, we're of course not excluding that there is physical matter in some sense that it has a relative function, but we're just saying it doesn't have any absolute solidity. So the problem is really that it's our cognizance that attributes solidity to phenomena. And we do this as if things truly exist. And that's where we could say that is what causes our confusion and our suffering. So you could say Buddhist analysis, and this is really what we could say empirical analysis. It's not belief system or religion. It points to the fact that however solid our appearances might appear, they are essentially empty. Ultimately, when we investigate, we cannot objectify anything. And quantum physics actually says the same. So it's not as if this is that difficult, really. But as a result, we talk about this reality that we call the unity of appearance and emptiness, or the unity of dependent arising and emptiness. So we confuse beings. What we do is in our solidifying reality, we're just as people who are caught in a dream. We think that these perceptions, they're real. So this is, you could say, an element of delusion. And that delusion, that is, you could say, what creates our experience. And that's what we work with in Buddhism. So we have, you could say, in terms of objective reality, we talk about a unity of appearance and emptiness, but we also take the subjective dimension of our delusion into account. And that's where philosophy is not enough, because we're actually, you could see, in need of therapy. We're in need of treatment for this delusional condition. And that's where the Buddhist teaching really is, you could say, like medicine that that is that is about curing this deluded experience that we call samsara. So when we're deluded, we have a sentient being. When we're non-deluded, we have a Buddha. But for the time being, just like the difference between a person who's healthy and someone who's ill, the ill person has the potential for becoming healthy, but there is a, you could say, the need for some remedial course, and so we need to go through the path. So this is where you could say this is different from just philosophy, which very often just operates with, you could say, a theoretical appreciation of how things are put together. And we don't really expect scientists or philosophers to necessarily be wise or saintly individuals. Whereas definitely in the Tibetan tradition, someone to actually, you could say, have an understanding of reality, it's not enough that it's just theoretical. It needs to be experienced. And that's why you could say there's a vast difference between a scientist and a sage. So this might be obvious to some of us, but it's definitely a premise of what we're going to look at here, that we're aware of this. So you could say we have this perspective of reality as the unity of appearance and emptiness. This is just what I'm writing here on the slide, yeah? And then we have the perspective of our individual subjective experience of that reality. And that's where we then have Buddhas and sentient beings. So a non-awake sentient being is someone who's caught in this confused projection of samsara. and there's something to be done about that. And that's where we have the remedial perspective of the path that clarifies confusion. So in brief, we have actual reality, empty appearance. Failing to recognize that actual reality, we have samsara, and we remedy this delusion through the path. So, as far as you could say the motivation then goes, why we're doing this, of course there's an immediate concern about our own sanity, our own suffering and so forth. But what's implicit in this is also that others are suffering. And that's where you could say the motivation that we want to bring to this study, as we'll now see, needs to be one that recognizes how the vast universe of sentient beings suffer, and in that something can be done where we're practicing the path. We want to practice the path keeping the welfare of all sentient beings in mind, and that's why we say in the Mahayana, in addition to renouncing the confusion, samsara, we also renounce the personal peace that we might obtain through the path, which is called nirvana. As long as there's sentient beings that are suffering, we are concerned about that. And so that's where we then have Kyabje Dilgo Khyentse, which is, you could say, initial recommendation, where he says that we need to begin preparing with what we call bodhicitta, the heart of awakening. And we need to have that as the motivation that we wish to benefit others through this teaching. So it really just means that when we are studying this text, we're doing this continually with the appreciation that we're doing something that could really help the entire larger community of sentient life. And in that we're approaching this particular text, it means that we are, you could say, cutting to the, going down, we're onto something that has tremendous weight because it comes not just from a, you could say, a self-help shelf or the sort of some self growth, personal growth program from somebody who just thought of this, but it comes from a lineage of, you could say, a tried and tested lineage of individuals who have a really felt experience and complete realization. We also say actually that the author here, Padampa Sangye, was prophesied by the Buddha, and as such he was somebody who, and the Buddha prophesied that he would benefit others. So he actually prophesied, he actually benefited sentient beings, firstly as the great scholar Kamalashila, who was immensely learned, and then the yogi Padampa Sangye. And if you read that that story of Milarepa, you could say he was really a consummate yogi, just like Milarepa, someone who attained complete liberation. Also, as Padampa Sangye, then he founded what we call the pacification of suffering school, which is one of what we call the 8 practice lineage chariots. And this particular teaching then is given to some of his students as he was about to pass away. And they say when he was about to pass away, the very moment, and as a, you could say, a rather humorous description of no longer being caught by ordinary duality, he said to the disciples as he was passing away, I don't know how to describe this type of disease. And commenting sort of humorously, says, bodily ills can be treated, but what I have is incurable. And it says he then fixed his gaze on the sky and passed away. So the implication of his illness here is that he had dissolved all duality. So his disease was enlightenment. So he was incurable. So Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche says that the 100 verses of advice is profound and yet easy to understand. The sincere practitioner will find in these verses all the instructions essential for the authentic practice of Dharma. So So here we go with the text itself. Starts off with then the homage. Homage to the teacher. Fortunate practitioners gathered here in Tingri, listen. Just as worn-out clothes can never again be made as new, it's no use seeing a doctor once you're terminally ill. You will have to go. We humans living on this earth are like streams and rivers flowing towards the ocean. All living beings are heading for that single destination. Now, like a small bird flying off from a treetop, I too will not be here much longer. Soon I must move on. So something that we always do or in general we do in Buddhist teachings is that we invoke the presence of enlightenment, sometimes in the form of bodhisattvas, in the form of the Buddha, in form of deities, or in form of the teacher. And so hence we have this homage. You could say it's saluting the result of the path, the embodiment of our objective. And we say this is the source of blessing. And this is something that goes beyond our ordinary, you could say, conceptual mind. So touching something deep in us, then we then have this, you could say, addressing the people of Tingri and their need for this teaching on Dharma. So something we're going to see quite extensively this teaching is Padampa Sangye returning to what often is referred to as the most weighty of the Buddha's teaching, which is the teaching on impermanence, the fact that life is running out. Yes, it can't be stopped, and in the end, everything must be left behind. We often hear this image that when we die, we will be like a hair which is smoothly pulled from a lump of butter. Nothing holds us back, and we have no other destination besides death. In general, you could say parlance, this is like a friend of mine would say, not polite dinner music, but there is a very constructive angle in this, and that is that something to be done. We have a unique opportunity presently, and this is why we need the Dharma then. So here, in a rather sort of elegant diminutive reference to himself, Padampa Sangye saying he's like a little bird. We can see that the implication here is that he's not too worried. He says, "Oh, I won't be here much longer, so I'm moving on." So that kind of, you could say, confidence is where Padampa Sangye is coming from. So we're sort of at the halfway mark. I haven't really done too much today. We're just about to start stanza 1, but usually we stop here if anybody has any questions. I'll just check. No? No particular questions? Okay. If you spend the present meaninglessly and leave with empty hands, people of Tingri, a human life in the future will be very hard to find. So the implication here is that right now we need to be very practical about this. And like I said, again, there is certainly some differences between our ordinary modern outlook with regards to something like this, saying that we're going to leave our life behind us with nothing whatsoever. There is a difference between that and the outlook that we find then here in an Indian or Indo-Tibetan context. See, the tragedy is the same. I mean, we're all going to pass on, and that is, you could say, as tragic in India and Tibet as it is with us. And you could say also the dogged habitual patterns that we have in regard to this is equally so among Indians and Tibetans. Um, everyone has been working their entire life striving to accumulate as much as possible, and leaves with tremendous regrets. But there is a difference between these cultures and ours, and that is that we haven't been in these cultures, there's not that bleakness that we're just zombies or you could say machines, mechanistic aggregations that just ends and like it's just switched off. From one point of view, you could say that's convenient. There's no real worry, and actually from the point of view of the Buddhist teaching, that is actually sort of, there's not really, and there wouldn't be any worry really in that case. But from the Buddhist point of view, it is actually a concern because there's nothing about the mind that is physical in that sense. And so there's quite some concern about doing something about this. So that's, you could say, where the Buddhists are coming from. In our culture, as much as we do have that sense that, yes, that's the end of it, we also have a tremendous sense of bleakness. And from that point of view, there's absolutely no point of discussing death. We wax philosophical and we sort of have nice little sort of facile comments and so on about death, but there's a sense that it's absolutely pointless to discuss this. Whereas here, there's a lot to be said about it. And that's where this discussion is immensely, you could say, constructive, immensely, you could say, pregnant with possibilities. And practically speaking, then, what one would do then is not assuming that one could figure it all out oneself. One would look for a qualified teacher and then receiving some guidance, pursue the path of enlightenment. So Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, he speaks about then how we need to not waste our time. We might sometimes think, and that also is common everywhere, that yeah, there'll be time in the future, maybe next year I'll do some retreat, or maybe in the future I'll really leave everything behind, and so on and so forth, postponing practice. But the thing is, we have the moment right now, and we never know when this will end. So Rinpoche, he gives the example of when the time is ripe, then farmers work without postponing, as they never know when the weather will turn. So there's just the right window. There's the right moment to sow. There's the right moment to harvest, and so forth. So based on the conditions of the weather, there's which is completely beyond the control then of anyone. Then the farmers have to get to work right when the time is the good one, right one. So likewise also, there's absolutely no such a thing as that the opportunity to practice is going to come later on. We need to practice right now that the opportunity is there. So again, this is something that you could say all Buddhists who have heard these teachings, they have heard so many times. But if you're a superficial person like myself, who constantly is just carried away by all sorts of really pretty inconsequential activities, then a reminder like this is immensely valuable. So to get down then to the constructive angle on this, to apply yourselves with body, speech, and mind to the sacred teachings, people of Tingri, is the best thing you can do. So our actions, what we're doing right now, determine our later experience. What we do now will make all the difference. We have a unique situation of freedom right now. The choice is clear. Avoid the causes of sorrow and thus be sure of happiness. We need to be attentive to how we condition our being. So the Tibetans actually have I'm not sure where it comes from, but they have a famous saying that if you want to know what you were in your past life, what you did, sorry, if you want to know what you did in your past life, look at your present body. And if you want to know what you will be like, what your future life will be like, look at your present actions. So this is really very different, again, from the what we could call deterministic discourse of religion. You know, the sort of idea that somebody else is going to take care of us or decide whether we've been good or bad boys and girls. And the idea that there's something greater that sort of determines what goes on. And it's also very different from the equally deterministic view that the universe has no direction or meaning, and it's just completely chance what is going to happen to us. It's just particularly the materialistic view on our, you say, consciousness, which is really that whatever we experience is really just chemistry. It's just neurons firing. All our emotional experience is pretty much non-events. Some refer to it even as folk psychology when we speak about emotions and so forth. And in reality, we should just talk about chemical going on. That's really what's happening in our lives. And see, that's also completely deterministic. That means that we have actually no say. Everything that we do and think is determined by um, these um, neurobiological processes. I guess the authors who write this, they also then assume that as they're writing this, they had no say in it, and they're just what they're writing is dictated by their own neurons. But here, and you can see both the view that there's somebody out there running the show or that it's just neurons firing is very disempowering. So the position that we take here, and as we actually experience again on a very empirical, immediate, everyday level of, you could say, our ordinary life, is that what we do actually makes a difference. And so that's where you could say the whole science around karma is very empowering. So it's really to understand that our present actions will determine our future experiences. In the future, we will have suffering or happiness, and that will be on the basis of what has been done in the past, just like our present experience is based on previous moments. So the implication here really is that we have this unique situation of having, you could say, sufficient information, having the faculties, having the leisure, having the freedom, and so forth, where we can practice the Dharma. Of course, we could argue that in Tibet there was sometimes more freedom, and in our case, modern society, we're sometimes very caught up with all the busyness of our lives and so forth. But I don't think we necessarily need to bemoan where we are right now. And every one of us has the, you could say, the power to actually work with their individual consciousness presently. So we should make an effort then to identify what is destructive in our mind and what is constructive. So we're really at crossroads. There's nothing that really prevents us from taking the road of happiness and liberation. And Khyentse Rinpoche quotes one of the sutras where it says, "The body is the boat that can lead you to the shore of liberation. The body is the stone that can make you sink into the abysses of samsara. The body is the servant of vice and of virtue." So we could say that the mind is a very open place, and we could sometimes say, we sometimes actually give the simile, the image of a crystal. So a crystal takes on the color of whatever you place it on. If you place it on a red cloth, it goes red. If you place it on a blue cloth, it goes blue. And you could say this actually reflects, you could say, the openness of the mind that's never tainted and actually caught by these red or blue. But at the same, and that's actually, you could say, a simile for the absolute nature of the mind. We very often use that in Mahamudra or Dzogchen teaching when describing, you could say, the what we call unobstructed nature of the mind. But on the relative level, where we do tend to objectify all these experiences that arise in the mind, we cling or fixate on what arises in the mind, then it actually makes a big difference what is arising in the mind and in our experience. So that's where we need to be very attentive to the relative conditioning of these perceptions. So that's where Khyentse Rinpoche says it's essential that we make an effort to mingle our physical, our verbal, our mental actions with the Dharma. And we have an inkling on how to do it. We've very often encountered, you could say, saintly persons like the Dalai Lama or other great teachers, the Khyentse Rinpoches, Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, His Holiness Sakya Trinzen, and so forth. And so there is some sense, also on an intuitive level, as you could say, conscientious humans, naturally moral beings. So we know actually what needs to be done. And that's where we need to be not just sloppy, but rather meticulous. Khyentse Rinpoche gives the example of the Brahmin Upagupta, who would sit and he would count actually how the thoughts that arose, whether they were negative or whether they were um, positive. And then he would sort of set aside white pebble, black pebble, and famously, as you've probably seen in teachings like the words of my perfect teacher or the jewel ornament of liberation and so forth, the comment is always in the beginning he had a lot of black pebbles and then eventually he had more white pebbles. But that kind of, you could say, uncompromising attentiveness to the content of the mind is really essential. Give your very life, heart, and soul to the three jewels. People of Tingri and their blessings cannot but arise. So when we say to give our life, heart, and soul to the three jewels, it's not really that it doesn't imply, you could say, blind faith in some external power that should provide miraculous salvation. It just really means realizing basic goodness that's intrinsic to us. But there's, you could say, there's some very real conditions that provide that, and that is what the three jewels are. So that's where you could say this surrender to the three jewels is seen as essential. So with serenity comes confidence in the basic goodness of reality and the three jewels. This dimension of blessing cuts through confusion and insecurity and empowers us. With that, we can handle good or bad circumstances. So you could say the faith that is spoken about here in the Buddha Dharma Sangha, the three jewels, comes from trust in the qualities of enlightenment as innate to our experience, to the innate, to reality in general. And Buddha Dharma Sangha is not something that produced this reality. It's not like a creator force, but it's just that the Buddha awoke to this reality. You could say the Dharma is the great unconditional nature of this reality properly experienced and seen. And those who are on the path to this, you could say, are refuges as well. So when we are serene or sane, we naturally are drawn to these qualities of enlightenment. They're not necessarily virtuous or even necessarily peaceful. We have a lot of appreciation for sometimes how strength and assertive action might be needed, or you could say unorthodox ways of helping. But this sort of overall appreciation of this quality of enlightenment that runs through our experience. This is something that's not owned by our ordinary, you could say, hopes and fears, our ordinary concepts. And once we appreciate that, then having that element of these three jewels, the element of, you could say, the vision of enlightenment and so forth, this provides a lot of empowerment. We call this blessing because it cuts through our ordinary concepts. It's something that lies beyond ordinary linear rationality. And it's something that when we experience it being touched by this, it's almost palpable. We might meet someone or have some experience that just touches us deeply. And it's something that we are touched. It's not just theory. So that kind of, you could say, surrendering life, heart, and soul then comes from such a place of deep, deep appreciation. So when we have that, there's a sense of connecting to a degree of greatness that lies beyond our ordinary constructs of who we are. So at that point, then there's also some sense of something sacred, a more powerful dimension. So when circumstances they might be pleasant or unpleasant, then there is also still the sense that we can handle this. We have some degree of the strength of compassion and wisdom that enables us to handle whatever appears. Forget your goals for this life. Concentrate instead on lives to come. People of Tingri, that is the highest goal. So it's a bit like when we're kids and we're in school. We're not particularly sort of worried too much about becoming adults, but if we actually follow through, this is quite helpful for us later on. So the implication really is that our future happiness will, to a great extent, depend on the effort we invest in developing certain skills. So with this short life, we have an opportunity to prepare for our future lives. Dharma is not merely just something about, you could say, which is really what I was brought up with in sort of an existentialist climate, nihilist existentialist climate, where there's not really anything you believe in except just that if you want to have a good life and a meaningful life, you have to figure out how to provide meaning to your existence, right? So Dharma is not really about that. It's not really something that is about being part of a really interesting community or all of that. It's really about unveiling a potential, a clarity that is innate to us and that we overlook. So we're really speaking of what we could call our greater future. the very long future. If we think of it in terms of time, of course, the whole issue of time is a construct that still operates with objectification. It's still a construct that's relative to samsara. But unless we wake up from that, then we are in samsara for a very long time. So it's entirely essential that we value and prioritize this. And that's where we should do this with an awareness of others. And we should wish to benefit them then with our experience of the path and what we've gained from the path in terms of the skills of wisdom and compassion. And that motivation needs to be basic to the entire path. You could say, as you often hear great Buddhist teachers explain, that all sentient beings, they aspire to be happy, yet they're blind, and what they in effect do is they work fiercely towards accomplishing their own suffering. So presently, we have the opportunity to put an end to this vicious circle through gaining essential insight into what it is that creates confusion and what it is that eliminates confusion. So we should continually see this path as something that we do together with all sentient beings. We're traveling or on this journey together with all sentient beings. It's quite, from the Mahayana point of view, the idea of entering into a personal nirvana, just a small little place of peace, is quite pathetic. So we we could say that that's pointless, and also not to speak about the kind of engagements that we sometimes get, or often get caught up, which is entirely just our own narrow, self-centered agendas, desperately trying to have some happiness in our ordinary existence. So either of these, you could say we need to renounce them and instead cultivate this attitude of bodhicitta, which is actually magnanimity, greatness, where once we have that, then all the actions that we then, all our actions of body, speech, and mind, when they come from this place, they naturally reflect that, you could say, core intention of love. So that when we have that, then even the tiniest acts becomes part of the journey to enlightenment. Khyentse Rinpoche gives this famous image of just like we have a tiny drop of water, and if we just keep it on itself, by itself, it quickly evaporates. But if we put it in the ocean, then of course it doesn't evaporate. So once we have, you could say, the dedication to other sentient beings, then anything we do coming from this motivation of love, the benefit of it never evaporates. So we say, so number 5, families are as fleeting as a crowd on market day. People of Tingri, don't bicker or fight. So Khyentse Rinpoche, he speaks of how he's witnessed family disputes and observed how even small hostile or possessive thoughts, they can eventually trigger great emotions, violent and destructive actions. So when people start families, he says, when people are drawn together due to their karma and so forth, then it's essential that they create the conditions for harmony. And he says nothing justifies quarreling. So we should not allow thoughts to create tensions in our family. This is essential. Rinpoche says, there is nothing good about quarrels. They cause great suffering for everyone involved. Make it your responsibility to be agreeable to all the members of your family and to try and turn, or rather to try to turn their minds little by little towards the Dharma, simply through kindness and setting a good example. So as far as, often we hear Buddhists, they're worried that their family or their friends might not connect with the Dharma, but I think what Khyentse Rinpoche is saying here is if we really want to bring people to the Dharma, then first of all we should be good examples, and that would have turned their minds to the Dharma more than anything. But the whole thing of bickering and fighting and quarreling comes from not recognizing how short a time we are together, and this we can often see in what people say when they're about to pass away. Now, this also applies to the Sangha in general, to the monastic communities, to Vajrayana, Sangha, and so forth. And this harmony is something that can be seen as the foundation of the Buddhist teaching. So it applies equally also to teachers and students. If the students, they manage to keep, you could say, pure commitments or pure samaya, then this actually enables them to not have obstacles. And also, so that's between the students and the teachers. And also among students themselves, especially when they received empowerment, so they're practicing in, you could say, a sadhana context, then it's essential that they maintain harmony. If someone actually begins to, you could say, corrupt the harmony, and actually, I remember once reading Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche say, as far as practicing in a sort of Vajrayana context together, people can be resentful and can kind of be upset, but they can't leave. Or you could say it's fatal if they decide to just leave. So there has to be this respect for the harmony, particularly when it comes to Vajrayana. And Rinpoche says, otherwise it's a bit like if you have a rat that drowns in a great vat of milk, because once that happens, then of course the whole milk becomes undrinkable. So that's it's really important, actually. Yeah. So any questions? No? Okay. Okay. Well, in that case, then we'll conclude. And sort of on an average, I think what we'd want to do is read 20 verses each time. So really the commentary is not that long. So yes, 20 stanzas each time. I think then we'll cover the 100 over the next 5 Thursdays. So thank you very much for participating in this study, and we'll conclude with dedication. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. Thank you very much.